The stars over Cadia trembled, not with the light of life, but with the faint quiver of dying embers. Constellations that had stood fixed in the heavens for millennia now bled into the black, their shapes swallowed by the vast, writhing wound of the Eye of Terror. Ships drifted like ash on an unfathomable tide, their hulls haloed in crimson warp fire. Every Cadian who looked upward that night felt the same silent truth pressing down upon them. The sky itself had grown sick. And yet, even in that moment, even with the shadow of damnation blotting out the constellations of their ancestors, we love you. We truly care for you. This story, heavy though it will be, is told so that you might remember not just the fall of a world, but the people who stood upon it until the very last heartbeat. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee and let's get started. Cadia was no stranger to war. She had been the first fortress and the last wall for 10,000 years, her children born with laser guns in their hands, their lullabies the thunder of distant artillery. But war is different when the enemy is not merely at the gates, but in the bones of the world itself. Lord Castellan Alaric Veyron stood alone on the observation deck of Casa Veyron, the bastion named for his line. The glass before him was shivering in its frame, the tremors from orbital bombardments a dozen leagues away crawling through the fortress walls. His armor was ceremonial tonight, deep green with gold edging, but he wore it as though it weighed 100 tons. The Blackstone fortress loomed above Cadia, a continent of shadow suspended in the void. Its edges caught the faint starlight, casting a cold gleam over the planet's upper atmosphere. For centuries, it had been both shield and mystery, its alien surface unyielding to all study, its purpose only partly guessed at. But Veyron had seen reports the others had not, reports that whispered of a deeper purpose, one that could damn or save the Imperium, depending on whose hand held the key. Far across the horizon, tracer fire stitched the sky, each luminous arc briefly revealing the silhouette of the western casas. The vox traffic in his ear was a constant storm. Requests for reinforcements, casualty counts, incoherent cries cut short by sudden silence. Veyron closed his eyes against it. He had been bred for this, every Cadian officer was, but the weight of command was not something one could truly be trained to bear. A junior officer approached, boot striking the steel with mechanical precision. "My lord," the soldier said, saluting sharply, "the High Command requests your presence in the War Council chambers." Veyron didn't answer immediately. His gaze was still fixed upward, to where the Blackstone fortress moved, barely but perceptibly in orbit. Its shift was not the drift of celestial mechanics, but the deliberate maneuver of something aware. "I will attend shortly," he replied at last, his voice flat, the words neither promise nor refusal. The officer hesitated, clearly unsettled, but departed without protest. Alone once more, Veyron allowed himself a single, treasonous thought. Cadia could not hold. It was not defeatism, it was mathematics. The eye was widening, the fleets of the War Master beyond counting, and the Imperium's reinforcements scattered thin across half a galaxy. Even if they drove back the first waves, more would come, and more, until there was nothing left to defend. But the fortress above, the fortress could change everything. He pressed his hands to the glass, as if by touch alone he could feel the ancient power sleeping in that alien colossus. To wield it might mean the salvation of the Imperium, but it might also mean the end of Cadia itself. Somewhere deep inside him, a quiet, unwelcome truth stirred. When the choice came, he did not know which he would choose. Outside, the stars kept trembling. The chamber of the High Command was a fortress within a fortress. Walls of black adamantine rose into vaults carved with the history of Cadia's wars. Each mural a frozen echo of victories bought with oceans of blood. It smelled faintly of oil and ozone, the scent of weapons long since cleaned but never forgotten. Lord Castellan Veyron entered to find the council already gathered. Generals, castle lords, commissars, and the dark, implacable figure of Lord Inquisitor Caziel, standing apart from them all. The lighting was low, the holomap of Cadia's surface, casting shifting shadows over every face. "We are losing Casapartogs," Marshal Guerin was saying, his voice tight. "The outer bastions are compromised, and the warp storms are making orbital reinforcement impossible. We must consolidate our forces to the central Cassars and abandon the outliers." "Abandon them," General Kalis spat, leaning forward over the table. "Those are Cadian families out there. Every man, woman, and child in those Cassars is a fighter or will be. We do not abandon our own. And we do not waste resources on lost positions," Guerin snapped back. "We cannot hold everywhere." Veyron took his place at the head of the table, letting the exchange burn itself out before he spoke. "Marshal Guerin is not wrong," he said evenly, "but neither is General Kalis. If we retreat too soon, morale will collapse. If we hold too long, we will bleed ourselves dry. We walk a blade's edge, and the wind is against us." Caziel's voice cut through the room like a blade drawn from a scabbard. "The calculus is simple. Cadia is the wall. It is not the people. It is the position. If holding it means the death of every Cadian soul, then that is the Emperor's will." Every eye turned toward him. The Inquisitor's face was unreadable beneath his hood, the augmetic lens over one eye gleaming in the dim light. "We will not waste time with sentimentality. The Emperor's domain stretches far beyond this world, and its defense cannot hinge upon the survival of its population. Do you disagree, Lord Castellan?" Veyron held his gaze. "I believe the wall does not stand without the men and women who guard it, and I believe that breaking them breaks Cadia, no matter what territory remains." Caziel's lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smile. Whether in mockery or approval, Veyron could not tell. The discussion wore on, each voice in the council chamber a different weapon in the same war. There were those who spoke of tactical withdrawals, those who argued for a final stand in every casa, and those, like Caziel, who saw the people themselves as expendable assets. Beneath the surface of every sentence was something darker: ambition, fear, old grudges sharpened into knives. When the meeting adjourned, Veyron was one of the last to leave. In the hallway beyond, footsteps matched his own. "Still caught between oaths, old friend?" The voice was low, familiar, and dangerous in its intimacy. Veyron turned to see Marshal Tragan stepping from the shadows. Once, they had fought side by side in the defense of Casa Dren, their squads holding the line for 9 days without food. But years in the upper ranks had turned them into something less than comrades and more than rivals. "I am not caught," Veyron replied. "I am weighing the cost." Tragan's eyes narrowed. "The cost is already clear. Terror will not save us. The Inquisition does not care for Cadia, only for its usefulness. When that usefulness ends, we will be left to burn. And if you cannot see that, then perhaps you are not the man I once thought you were." Veyron said nothing. Tragan stepped closer, lowering his voice further. "There are others, in command and beyond, who will not let that happen. but they will not wait forever for you to decide where your loyalties truly lie. With that, Tregan turned and vanished into the shadowed corridors, leaving Veyron standing alone with the echo of his words. The lights flickered above, a momentary dimming as if the fortress itself shivered. Outside, thunder rolled, not from the sky, but from the guns of distant cassers, hammering into the night. In that moment, Veyron felt it again. The knowledge he had tried to bury since the night he first saw the Blackstone fortress shift in the heavens. Cadia was the wall, but even walls could be ground into dust, and perhaps the only way to save the Imperium was to let the wall fall. The thought should have horrified him. Instead, it lingered, like a shadow waiting to grow. The warp had always been a scar in the sky above Cadia, visible at night as a shifting bruise on the stars. But now, the wound bled openly. It began with the screams, not human ones, those were expected in war, but the thin, metallic cries of the astropaths. One by one, they collapsed in their sanctums, blood seeping from their eyes, their minds clawed open by something vast and unseen. They died clutching at nothing, their lips shaping words no one wanted to hear. The last to fall whispered it with certainty. The gate is turning. Lord Castellan Veyron read the report in silence, his jaw tight. The astropathic choir was their lifeline to the wider Imperium, the nerve that let Cadia call for aid and coordinate her scattered fleets. Now, the choir was silent, and the galaxy had gone cold. Outside the fortress walls, the storms began. At first, they were no more than strange flickers in the sky, warp lightning painting the clouds in colours no mortal tongue could name. But as the hours passed, those colours deepened, bleeding into reality until the air itself began to taste of metal and ash. Vox traffic filled with distorted whispers, the words of the living tangled with alien voices that seemed to answer questions no one had asked. In the bastion of Casa Mirac, the first demonic breach was reported. Sergeant Raleig's transmission was sharp, urgent and short. They came out of the air, no, out of the Emperor preserve us. The channel dissolved into static and the wet sound of tearing flesh. By the time Veyron dispatched a rapid response unit, Casa Mirac was already gone. The survivors, if any existed, were beyond retrieval. He stood in the command chamber, staring at the hololith of Cadia. Red markers spread across it like infection, each representing an incursion point, each growing faster than the defensive sigils could counter. The Blackstone fortress hung in the map's upper projection, unchanged, unmoved, as if indifferent to the suffering below. "Status of the void shields?" he asked without looking away. "Flickering, my lord," came the reply from Captain Dresk. "Not failing yet, but whatever's coming through the warp is pushing on them, like they're being tested." Tested. The word stuck in Veyron's mind. The War Master did nothing without purpose, and these probing strikes, these sudden breaches, felt less like the main assault, and more like the careful hand of a torturer testing where the flesh would tear first. He turned to Dresk. "Double the garrison in Casa Partox and Casa Vaden. Rotate regiments through in shorter intervals. We can't afford fatigue to set in." "And the astropathic silence?" Dresk asked. Veyron hesitated. To admit the truth would seed panic through every Kazran regiment on the planet. "We'll re-establish contact," he said instead, voice like stone. "We have to." That night, he did not sleep. Instead, he walked the upper battlements of Casa Veyron, the wind sharp enough to cut through his armor seals. From here, the horizon was an unbroken line of black, lit only by the flicker of distant fire and the warping glow of the eye. And high above, Like a vulture circling a dying animal, the Blackstone fortress drifted, its position unchanged, watching, waiting. He thought of the astropaths dying, words. The gate is turning. If the eye of terror was a wound, then Cadia was the bone holding it in place. And if that bone broke, the galaxy would bleed without end. Footsteps approached from behind. It was Marshal Tregan again, his expression grim in the torchlight. "You've seen the pattern, haven't you?" Tregan said, without preamble. "This is the first coil tightening. The enemy's not here to take the planet in one blow. They're here to grind us, to make us choose between our strength and our sanity." Veyron said nothing. "You've always played the long game," Tregan continued, his voice lower now. "But this is a game where the board itself is turning against you. And when the gate opens fully," he gestured to the sky, "no wall can stand against that." Veyron's eyes shifted back to the fortress. In the warp-tainted light, it almost seemed to move, as if in answer. He did not know if the motion was real or imagined, but the thought whispered again through his mind. Seductive, treacherous, persistent. Perhaps the only way to save the Imperium was to let Cadia fall. The city lay silent in the aftermath, where once its towers caught the light of distant suns. Now only jagged spires jutted into a blood-red sky. The siege of Sarathis had ended not in surrender, but in ruin. From the highest bastion to the lowest sewer tunnel, there was nothing left untouched by the fire of war. Khan walked alone through the smouldering streets, his boots crunching over glass and bone. Each step echoed like a heartbeat through the hollow city. The smell was a blend of iron, ash, and something older, something that spoke of death beyond the physical. Sarathis was not merely dead, it was cursed. The Iron Warriors had fought here. That much was obvious from the precision of the destruction. Fortifications broken in clean, clinical lines, the enemy's stubborn resistance punished methodically. But there was another mark, one far subtler, one Khan could feel in the marrow of his bones. The shadows themselves seemed to breathe, as if the city retained the memory of screams and whispered them back to any who dared to listen. Khan had come not for conquest, but for a meeting. A warlord of the World Eaters in those days did not parley lightly, yet the one who had summoned him had chosen Sarathis precisely because no sane man would seek it willingly. He arrived at the appointed place, a shattered temple, its god statue decapitated, the marble head lying half-buried in soot. A voice came from within the ruin, low and measured. "You are late." The figure emerged, clad in armor the color of old bronze, marked with symbols that shifted faintly when one looked too long. His helm was under one arm, revealing a face carved in severe lines, the eyes deep pools of intent. "Erebus," Khan said flatly. The first chaplain of the word-bearers inclined his head. "It seems the wars of this age consume even the swiftest blades. But I am glad you came." Khan's hand rested on the haft of Gorechild. "You asked for me. Speak quickly." Erebus stepped closer, and though the ground beneath them was strewn with ash, not a speck clung to his armored greaves. His voice carried the rhythm of a sermon, each word weighted and deliberate. "There is a war greater than these petty sieges, Khan. Greater than the Imperium itself. The gods are not distant idols. They are hungry. They can be sated, and they can be served. You have fought for the Emperor and for Angron, but I tell you, there is another path, one that leads to eternity." Khan's gaze hardened. Eternity is a word for cowards afraid to die. Erebus smiled thinly, undeterred. "You think death will claim you and make an end of you? Number death will claim you and remake you. The gods I speak of will see to that. But you have a choice: to be remade as a pawn, or to be remade as a champion. The silence between them was thick. From somewhere deep within the ruins came the faint sound of stone grinding on stone, too slow, too deliberate, to be mere settling rubble. Khan felt the weight of unseen eyes upon him. "I am not here to kneel," Khan said finally, "and I do not bargain with priests." Erebus's smile deepened, as if this refusal had been expected. "No, you are here to listen, and you have listened. That is enough, for now." He turned to leave, his voice lingering in the air like a fading hymn. "The day will come when Angron himself will walk the path I offer, and when he does, you will not be far behind. Remember Sarathis, Khan. Remember the whispers." Khan remained alone in the shadow of the broken temple long after Erebus had gone. He could not deny the sense that something beneath the city had stirred, something that had heard his name. The wind shifted, and he swore he heard his own heartbeat answer it, not as a rhythm of flesh and blood, but as the pounding of distant war drums. It was then he realized that Sarathis had not simply been a meeting ground, it had been a seed, and whatever had been planted here was already taking root. The war halls of Golvor dripped with the scent of iron and fire. Here, beneath vaults lined with the skulls of 1,000 enemies, the chosen of the warband gathered. Torches hissed in sconces carved from the rib cages of fallen champions, their flickering light casting long shadows across the circle of warriors. At the center stood Khan, his breath misting in the cool air, his eyes fixed on the brass altar before him. Upon it lay the ritual blade of Karakth, an ancient weapon etched with a labyrinth of runes, each line a story of blood and betrayal. The air pulsed with the weight of expectation. Around him, the chosen were silent. No man here was untested. Each had stood in the storm of bolter fire and spat defiance at the void. But tonight was not battle. It was the blooding. And the blooding was older than any war. "Step forward." Khan's voice was low, but it carried through the hall like the roll of distant thunder. The first warrior advanced. His armor was still scarred from the siege of Elric's gate, the gouges unpainted, left raw to show the truth of his wounds. He knelt before the altar, head bowed. Khan lifted the ritual blade, pressing it to the warrior's brow until a thin line of crimson welled and ran down the man's nose. "Speak your oath," Khan commanded. The warrior's voice was steady. "I swear upon the blood of my fathers and the marrow of my bones. My life is the War Master's, my death the blood god's. Let my name be written in the ledger of slaughter." The blade drank his blood, the runes along its length glowing faintly for a heartbeat before fading. Khan nodded, stepping aside as the next warrior approached. The ritual repeated, each oath binding them tighter, not just to the warband, but to the path they could never leave. Some spoke their words with pride, others with grim acceptance. None hesitated. When the last oath was spoken, Khan turned to the warband and raised the blade high. The hall erupted in the beat of fists on breastplates, a low, thunderous rhythm that grew until it shook the very stones. "Then hear me, brothers," Khan roared. "The omens are clear. The blood tide rises. The walls of the false emperor will tremble beneath our wrath. Before the moons of Kelmore wane we march, and the galaxy will remember our names in terror." A roar like the bellow of beasts filled the war halls. The chosen slammed their weapons together, sparks leaping into the torchlight. Outside, the warships loomed in their berths, engines thrumming, eager for the void. But as Khan lowered the blade, he felt the faintest echo of unease, a shadow at the edge of his thoughts. It was gone in an instant, drowned in the war chant of his brothers. Yet it lingered, like the taste of ash on the tongue, a warning unheeded. For the blooding had bound them together, yes, but it had also marked them. And there were powers, ancient and patient, who had been watching. The vox chambers of Casa Veyron were labyrinthine tunnels of humming machinery and tangled wires. Here, messages crossed the void, bearing commands from terror, cries of despair from the front lines, and secrets whispered in frequencies only the most trained ears could catch. Tonight, the chamber pulsed with a different energy, one that made the very air hum with uneasy anticipation. Lord Castellan Alaric Veyron stood before the main comm terminal, his gauntleted hands resting on the cold metal surface. The regular chatter of duty calls and battle reports had fallen away, replaced by static and faint broken voices that flickered in and out like ghosts. "Is something wrong with the Vox, Captain?" Veyron asked, voice low but tense. Captain Dresk's face was pale under the dim red light. "The channels are flooded with interference, my lord. Not from the warp storms, but from something else. We're picking up a voice, repeating over and over. It's speaking directly to us." Veyron's brow furrowed. "A voice? What is it saying?" Dresk hesitated. "It's difficult to translate, but the words are clear. The War Master calls. The throne must be broken. The gate will turn. Choose your path, Lord Castellan." The room seemed to grow colder. Veyron's heart beat unevenly. The War Master, a name whispered in dread and betrayal, reaching out through the void. Was it a trick, a demon's lure, or a warning? He reached out, fingers brushing the Vox controls, attempting to isolate the signal. But the voice persisted, steady and insistent, weaving its message like a dark thread through the comms. Veyron stepped back, eyes shadowed. The voice spoke of survival through allegiance, of strength through defiance, and of a fate intertwined with the turning of the gate that sealed Cadia's doom. Could it be a demon? Dresk ventured, voice barely above a whisper. Or a summons, Veyron replied, eyes distant. A choice. Outside, the storm of war raged on. But inside the walls of Casa Veyron, the greatest battle was now being waged within the mind of its lord. Was he to stand unyielding for a dying empire, or listen to the whispers promising a different path, one paved with sacrifice, betrayal, and the hope of salvation beyond the stars? The Vox chambers hummed on, the War Master's voice threading through the silence like a serpent. And somewhere deep inside, Alaric Veyron felt a seed of doubt take root. The dawn was not a dawn at all. It was a fracture in the endless night. Flares of burning fire and the shriek of drop pods piercing the warped sky above Casa Partox. The fortress world's outer defenses buckled beneath an onslaught that had been predicted but never truly imagined. From the ramparts, Lord Castellan Alaric Veyron watched as the first wave of chaos forces spilled like a flood across the shattered plains. Demonic beasts tore through the Imperial lines with savage hunger, while corrupted tanks spat fire and smoke that choked the air. But it was not only the enemy outside that weighed upon him. Inside the command chamber, his officers debated strategy with voices sharp as bayonets. Every plan met with doubt, every order shadowed by fear. "Hold the line," Veyron commanded, his voice carrying through the chamber. "Reinforce the eastern bulwark and deploy the 9th Cadian shock troops to the breach." General Kalis nodded grimly. "They will need every rifle and every drop of courage, my lord. The enemy fights with madness." "Madness is a weapon," Veyron answered. We must wield it as well. The voxcasters crackled. A message came through, a warning from a scout unit trapped beyond the perimeter. Their last words were frantic, broken. Warp, breach, more. Static swallowed the rest. Veyron's mind flickered back to the War Master's voice. The whispered choice, the turning gate. The weight of command had never felt heavier. Every decision was a blade edge between salvation and ruin. Outside, the sound of battle rose, a symphony of explosions, screams, and the relentless thunder of bolter fire. The walls shuddered under assault. In the chaos, a shadow moved among the commanders. Captain Dresk's face was pale as he approached Veyron with urgency. "My lord, there's a report of a saboteur within the ranks. Someone undermining our defenses from the inside." Veyron's eyes narrowed. "Find them. Bring them to me." He turned back to the viewport, watching as the enemy pressed in, the line between survival and annihilation thinning with every breath. In that moment, the line between loyalty and betrayal blurred, and somewhere in the darkness, the War Master's voice echoed still. The corridors of Casa Veyron were a maze of shadows and whispered fears. Guards paced with tight grips on their laser guns, eyes darting to every dark corner as though the walls themselves might betray them. The fortress had become a cage, not just from the enemy without, but from the enemy within. Lord Castellan Veyron stood in the dim interrogation chamber, the stale air heavy with the scent of sweat and fear. Before him, Captain Dresk watched silently as 2 prisoners were brought in, both high-ranking officers accused of sabotage. Veyron's voice was cold but measured. "Speak. What proof have we that you betrayed Cadia?" The first prisoner, a grizzled sergeant named Malric, spat. "I am loyal to the last breath. This is a farce." The second, Lieutenant Kalen, trembled, eyes flickering with panic. "You have no evidence. We've done nothing but defend Cadia." But the damage was done. Trust had shattered like brittle glass. Whispers raced faster than any fleet. Doubt was a contagion more lethal than any demonic plague. Veyron's mind turned inwards, the weight of command crushing. Could he root out the traitor before they delivered the final blow? Or was the betrayal not one person, but a poison spread through the very veins of Cadia's leadership? Outside, the bombardment intensified. Each explosion sent tremors through the fortress, a grim reminder that the enemy pressed relentlessly. The eye of terror's madness seeped deeper into the soul of the world, and the lines between friend and foe began to blur. In the War Council, alliances formed and fractured in whispers. Even those sworn to the Emperor's light began to question, to suspect. Veyron's gaze drifted to the Blackstone fortress, hanging above like a silent sentinel, watching, waiting. Its purpose remained a mystery, yet the fate of all hung in its balance. The storm was closing in, and within the storm, the greatest betrayal was yet to come. The War Council chamber was suffused with a tense silence, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery and the crackle of static over the voxcasters. Lord, Castellan Veyron stood at the center, eyes sharp and heavy with the burden of command. The night was long, and the siege had turned from a clash of armies into a battle of trust and suspicion. Captain Dresk's face was drawn as he stepped forward, voice low but firm. "My lord, the evidence is clear. Lieutenant Kalen has been in communication with the enemy. Vox logs show transmissions intercepted and decoded, secret messages sent during our darkest hours." The chamber stirred with gasps and murmurs. Kalen stood accused, his pallor deepening as he was forced to meet the eyes of those who once considered him a brother in arms. Veyron's gaze did not waver. "Lieutenant Kalen, speak for yourself." Kalen's voice trembled but held a stubborn edge. "You do not understand. I did what I had to do to save Cadia. The enemy's strength is overwhelming. We are lost. Unless what?" Veyron pressed. Kalen's eyes flickered with desperation. "There is a way to end this without annihilation, but it requires sacrifice, choices no man wishes to make." The chamber held its breath. Before anyone could respond, the doors slammed open. Sergeant Malric stormed in, rage burning in his eyes. "He lies. Kalen is a traitor. I've seen the proof. His hand guides the enemy's strikes." The room erupted into chaos, voices rising in accusation and defense. Veyron raised his hand, calling for order. "Enough!" His voice rang with authority that cut through the clamor. "We will not fall apart in our darkest hour. Lieutenant Kalen, if your actions serve Cadia, prove it. If not, then face the consequences." Kalen nodded slowly. "I will do what I must." The siege outside intensified, the walls trembling as the enemy pushed ever closer. Trust shattered, alliances strained, and the fate of Cadia balanced on a knife's edge. In the shadows beyond the chamber, unseen eyes watched the unfolding drama, the true puppet masters stirring as the final moves approached. The dim glow of the command chamber flickered, casting long shadows that danced like spectres upon the cold walls. Lieutenant Kalen stood before the War Council, his armor scratched and stained, his face pale but resolute. He cleared his throat, the weight of countless eyes upon him pressing like the void itself. "I have not betrayed Cadia," he began, voice steady, though heavy with burden. "What I have done is a necessary deception. The enemy you face is not merely mortal. They are empowered by a force ancient and terrible. They have breached the warp in ways we cannot hope to match by conventional arms." A murmur rippled through the assembled commanders. Kalen raised a hand, silencing them. "I have communicated with a faction within the Chaos Forces, one that opposes the War Master's will. They seek to overthrow their own Dark Masters, to end this endless war of destruction." Veyron's eyes narrowed. "You bargained with demons?" Kalen nodded. "Yes, but not to betray Cadia, to buy us time, to open a chance for survival." The room was thick with disbelief and fury. Sergeant Malric stepped forward, fists clenched. "You consorted with liars and monsters while our people died." Kalen met his glare without flinching. "Better to bargain with devils than die blindly. I offered my loyalty to their enemies to weaken the War Master's grip on the siege." Veyron weighed the truth in those words against the price paid. The suffering outside the walls, the broken trust within. "Your gambit is perilous," he said at last. "If this faction is genuine, it may shift the tide. But if it is a trap..." Kalen's jaw tightened. "Then we fall, one way or another." Outside, the distant thunder of war drums echoed through the night. The eye of terror's light bled into the skies, casting eerie hues over the shattered land. Time was running out. Veyron stepped down from his place at the head of the table and fixed his gaze on Kalen. "Prepare your emissaries. We will hear what this faction desires." As Kalen bowed and left to ready his messengers, Veyron felt the crushing weight of destiny settle upon him. The choice was not simply survival or death. It was what survival would cost, and whether Cadia could bear that price remained uncertain. The emissaries came cloaked not in the garb of angels nor demons, but in shadows that seemed to flicker between both realms. They moved through the battered halls of Casa Veyron with a silence that unsettled even the most battle-hardened sentinels. Their armor was chipped and scorched, bearing symbols that twisted and shifted like living shadows. The mark of the obscure faction Kaelin had spoken of. Lord Castellan Veyron received them in the war council chamber, the weight of the siege pressing against every stone of the fortress. His eyes bore into the laid emissary, a figure whose presence seemed to ripple the very air as if the void itself had stepped through the threshold. We come not as conquerors, but as rivals to the War Master's vision. The emissary's voice was a whisper, yet filled the chamber like a roar. The path you walk leads only to ruin. We offer a different way, one that can save Cadia and fracture the chains of endless war. Veyron's expression was unreadable. And what price do you ask for this salvation? The emissary smiled, a fleeting gesture that revealed too many teeth. Sacrifice, betrayal, loyalty tested beyond its limits. The gods we serve demand blood, but also choice. Behind the emissaries, the assembled commanders exchanged uneasy glances. Doubt was a blade sharper than any sword, and it cut deeper still when wielded in whispers. Captain Dresk leaned toward Veyron, voice low. Can we trust them, my lord? Or are we stepping into a snare? Veyron's gaze remained fixed on the emissary. Trust is a currency too expensive in times like these, but survival demands we gamble with it. As the emissaries laid bare their terms, a secret weapon buried deep within the Eye of Terror, a weakness in the War Master's forces, the council felt the fragile hope stir. Yet beneath that hope lay the unspoken fear. To accept this pact was to invite darkness, not just without, but within. Outside, the skies writhed with warp storms and the distant roar of war. Inside, alliances teetered on the edge of collapse. The game had changed, and the true battle for Cadia's soul was only just beginning. The uneasy pact forged in the shadowed chamber of Casa Veyron had barely taken root before it was tested by fire. The war horns blared across the shattered plains, a summons not from friend but foe. The emissaries' whispered promises hung like fragile threads amid the storm, as Cadia's defenders scrambled to rally. In the depths of the fortress, suspicion festered. The saboteur's shadow loomed larger with each passing hour, trust fractured beyond repair. Officers eyed each other warily, their bonds strained by fear and uncertainty. Veyron moved through the halls like a spectre, weighed down by the knowledge that the enemy was no longer solely outside the walls. The whispered warnings from the War Master's voice echoed in his mind, each syllable a reminder of the choice he faced: surrender to despair, or embrace the darkness to save what remained. Then came the blow, a shattering revelation that tore through the council like a thunderclap. Captain Dresk, once loyal to the last breath, was revealed as the betrayer. His motives were tangled in ambition and desperation, his allegiance swayed by promises of power from the unseen gods beyond the gate. When confronted, Dresk did not deny his treachery. Instead, he smiled with a cold finality and unleashed a hidden signal that sent the fortress into chaos. The walls shook as warp-tainted energies surged through the defensive grids, opening new breaches for the enemy to pour through. Screams echoed through the corridors, and the line between friend and foe dissolved into madness. Veyron's heart pounded as he rallied the remaining loyalists, fighting not only the external horde, but the betrayal that gnawed at the fortress's core. In that crucible of fire and blood, the true cost of survival was revealed: sacrifice, loss, and the shattering of trust. As the skies bled warp fire and Cadia teetered on the brink, the echoes of the War Master's voice promised that the gate would turn, and with it, the fate of all. The sky above Casa Veyron was torn asunder, a fractured canvas of swirling warp storms and the blazing fires of war. The fortress stood battered but unbroken, its walls bleeding under relentless assault. Within its shattered halls, the War Council gathered for what might be the last time. Lord Castellan Alaric Veyron's face was etched with the weight of endless nights spent in battle and doubt. Around him, commanders spoke in urgent whispers, their voices heavy with despair and resolve. The traitor Dresk was dead, cut down by loyal hands in a final, brutal reckoning, but his betrayal had unleashed chaos too deep to undo. "We cannot hold forever," Veyron said, voice grim yet steady. "The enemy's tide grows stronger, their warp-tainted forces tearing at our defenses like ravenous beasts." Lieutenant Kalin stepped forward, his gaze unwavering despite the carnage around them. "There is still a chance, my lord. The emissary's weapon, the Blackstone detonator, can shatter the gate's warp veil. It could buy us enough time to evacuate and regroup." "But at what cost?" General Kalis questioned, his hand clenched around a datapad. "Destroying the gate could unleash untold horrors upon the sector." Veyron's eyes darkened. Better to face one storm than be drowned by many. The council fell silent, the enormity of the decision settling like a shroud. Outside, the fortress trembled beneath another siege wave. The distant screams of dying warriors mingled with the unearthly howls of demons spilling through newly opened breaches. With a heavy heart, Veyron gave the order. "Prepare the detonator. We will light the fuse on Cadia's last hope." As the device was transported through the ruined corridors, a somber procession followed, a line of brothers ready to sacrifice everything. In the depths of the fortress, Khan stood alone, his thoughts a tempest. The blood of his warband cried out for vengeance, yet even he felt the gravity of the moment. The fall of Cadia was no longer just a battle. It was the end of an era, a reckoning written in fire and blood. The detonator was set. Veyron's fingers trembled as he activated the sequence, the countdown beginning in the dark silence. Outside, the skies roared in fury, stars dimming as the gate's veil began to unravel. And in that final moment, as the fortress held its breath, the fate of 1,000 worlds hung in balance. The corridors trembled with a mounting dread, a chorus of whispered prayers and dying breaths. The detonator's countdown echoed through the fortress like the slow ticking of an ancient clock, each second dragging the weight of fate closer to its inexorable end. Lord Castellan Alaric Veyron stood atop the highest bastion, his gaze fixed on the shattered horizon, where the eye of terror churned with malevolent fury. Around him, the last defenders of Cadia braced against the final assault. Grim faces illuminated by the flicker of burning ruins and the ghastly light of the warp storms. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and blood. Somewhere deep beneath the fortress, the Blackstone detonator pulsed with ominous energy, its core glowing like a dying star poised to unleash devastation. It was a weapon born of ancient technology and desperate hope, a final gamble to sever the chains that bound Cadia's fate to the War Master's dark designs. Veyron's mind raced with memories, the laughter of brothers lost to the void, the silent promises made in the blood-soaked trenches, and the haunting voice that had whispered through the Vox chambers, calling him to choose. Now there was no choice left, only consequence. The device ignited. A cataclysmic pulse surged outward, ripping through the warp veil like a scythe through silk. The sky fractured, a kaleidoscope of stars bleeding into darkness as the gate began to unravel. The ground shook violently, throwing soldiers to their knees. Walls crumbled, and the very air screamed with the agony of a dying world. Amid the chaos, Khan's warband carved a path through the oncoming tide, their fury a tempest of steel and rage. But even the blood god's favor could not stem the tide of destiny. As the detonator's blast consumed the gate, a silence fell, a vast echoing void filled with loss and bitter victory. Cadia was broken. Yet from the ashes whispers spread, of sacrifice and survival, of empires lost and legends born. And the war, endless as the stars themselves, marched on. The stars above Cadia's shattered plains were dim, their ancient light flickering like fading embers. The war was over, not with triumphant victory, but with a silence so heavy it pressed upon the soul like the weight of a tomb. Lord Castellan Alaric Veyron stood alone amidst the ruins, his once proud armour battered and stained, his eyes hollow from endless loss. Around him lay the remnants of a world that had stood as a bulwark against the encroaching darkness for millennia, now broken and crumbled. The Blackstone detonator's cataclysm had severed the gate's veil, halting the tide momentarily, but the cost was more than stone and blood. It was the death of an era, the shattering of hope, and the birth of a legend etched in sacrifice. Veyron's thoughts drifted to the brothers who had fallen. Their names now whispers in the wind, their faces burned into memory. Khan, the blood god's herald, had survived the carnage, his warband scattered but unbroken, a living storm of vengeance and fury. But even he knew that immortality was no shield against the hollow ache of watching worlds die. The War Master's shadow lingered still, a stain upon the stars that no light could fully erase. The galaxy was changed forever, its fate bound to the choices made in those desperate hours. Veyron raised his gaze to the horizon, where the first light of dawn fought to break through the lingering darkness. The war would rage on, relentless and eternal. Yet in this fragile moment, the silence sang a dirge for Cadia, a requiem for the fallen and a warning to those who would follow. The price of survival was etched in blood and ruin. The empire had fallen, but its legacy endured, in the hearts of the few who remembered, in the whispers carried on the void winds, and in the unyielding flame of defiance that still burned. And so, as the sun set on a broken world, a new chapter awaited, one born from the ashes of loss and the hope that even in darkness, a spark could ignite the stars anew.